Wonderful. Good luck.
Thank you. Hello all. My name is Anubandh, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this EU-India People Summit, which started on 1st of May and will last until 8th of May. And why we are doing this summit? Because there's this official diplomatic summit, which is going to happen on 8th of May between India and EU, and access to which is denied in a way. So that's where this idea came. Today is the 6th day of the summit, and the panel that I will be leading today is populism and nationalism. And we have some renowned experts with us. Before I request them for introduction, I just wish to make a small announcement or a deep concern that we have for what is happening in India and in the context of COVID and in everywhere else in the world. And we really hope that things will improve. So with these thoughts, I first tell you the experts that we have. We have Christophe Jaffrelot with us. We also have Sandra Destradi. We have Sten Widmalm, and we have Mukulika Banarjee. And I request them to introduce themselves in the same order. Thank you.
Thank you, and congratulations for this initiative that is really pan-European. Well, I'm Christophe Jaffrelot. I am a senior research fellow at CERI, the research center dealing with international affairs at Sciences Po in Paris, and I also teach at the King's India Institute at King's College in London.
Hello, everybody. Thanks a lot for inviting me to this panel. My name is Sandra Destradi. I hold the chair of international relations at the University of Freiburg in Germany.
Hello, my name is Sten Widmalm. I work at the Department of Government at Uppsala University, and I do my research mostly in South Asia, but also here in Europe on the related issues we discussed today. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Mukulika Banarjee. I'm a social anthropologist based at the London School of Economics and Political Science. I grew up in India, but have spent the last 30 odd years living in the UK, first in Oxford and then in London. I'm a committed European living in Britain, although Indian by nationality. And I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you all. So with this, I request Christophe to begin. He would talk about affinities between populism and authoritarianism. Christophe.
Thank you, Anu. I'll try to do justice to this very large subject without encroaching too much on the Indian domain that my colleagues will be in a position to scrutinize after me. The point I want to make is really this one. How can we explain the decline of democracy across the globe? And is there any correlation between this decline of democracy and the rise of populism? We are in a situation today where democracy is indeed in retreat, but not in retreat because of military coups. That was something of the 20th century, even if we've seen that in Egypt and more recently in Myanmar. But no, most of the time, democracy declines because of civilians, because of politicians. And we have different examples in today's world, Erdogan, Rajapaksa, Bolsonaro, and Narendra Modi. So the question is, have these populists been responsible for the decline of democracy? And if so, there is a paradox, of course, because populists claim that they are fighting for a better democracy. They want to give people power again and against elite, which are supposed to have captured power. Well, there is indeed a paradox. They claim that they will make a better democracy, and most of the time they make a kind of authoritarian regime. That's what I'm going to explain. This is the correlation, the relation that I'm going to focus upon. And in the first part of my presentation, I'll be, I would say, very general, looking at large concepts. but I will try to refine them in the second part, and you will see what is the logic behind. Well, I would say that there are affinities between populism and authoritarianism, primarily because there is on both sides a strong emphasis on personal power. Populisms, all kinds of populisms, rely on heroes, politicians who claim to represent the people, who have a very specific relationship with the people. This is something Pierre Ostigi, among the theoreticians of populism, has shown, I think, better than anybody else. He shows that on one hand, populist leaders are conduits for expressing the resentment and even the revenge of those of the bottom, on the bottom, and the way they try to share their culture, their manners, their language by opposition to the elite's propriety. They are like us, these populists. And from that standpoint, most of the time they claim to be victims of the elite, victims of the media, the English-speaking media in the case of India, for instance, the East Coast media in the case of Trump, for instance. They project themselves as victims, and this is precisely what the people feel, that they are victims as well. On the other hand, these populists are the saviors of the people, and they have supernatural qualities. At least they can claim and they can be recognized as superhuman. And this description harks back to the basic definition of charisma by Max Weber. Max Weber never considered that charismatic leaders were defined by virtue. They were defined by the extraordinary powers they could mobilize, which make them above the crowd, above the ordinary people. So they are like us and our ego ideals, as Ostigi says. Well, when you win elections on that basis as a hero, the moment you have power, you concentrate power in your hands almost automatically. First of all, the members of parliament have been elected because of you, and they are your majority. They pay personal allegiance to you. And secondly, you delegitimize very easily oppositions, all kinds of oppositions. How can the opposition get any respect if I am the people? They cannot compete with my legitimacy. And that's true vis-a-vis politicians. This is, by the way, what Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt have emphasized in their book, How Democracy Dies. How Democracies Die, that's much more correct. And that's also what you can see vis-a-vis NGOs, vis-a-vis universities. All kind of dissent is delegitimized the moment the leader can claim that he is the people. But that goes beyond politicians, universities, NGOs, and so on. It affects the institutions, in particular the judiciary. You know, this is very clear in the Indian case, where not so long ago, Arun Jaitley criticized the tyranny of the unelected, the judiciary. The tyranny of the unelected is precisely an attack on the other pillar of democracy. Democracy is a coin with two faces. There is a democratic face. People have to vote. There is a liberal face. You have institutions, and they are in charge of free and fair elections, among other things. So the populist will make the democratic face predominant at the expense of the liberal face. That is not legitimate, again, because it has not been elected. And this is why you can see in many of these countries reforms of the Supreme Courts, of the way judges are appointed, something that failed, by the way, in the case of India, but with consequences anyway. It has worked in Sri Lanka, in Hungary, in so many other places where the judiciary has lost its independence. And beyond the judges, beyond the judiciary, the bureaucracy is also made of trusted lieutenants. You have a politicization of the state. So we have clear evidence of affinities between populism and authoritarianism. But once we've said that, we need to go one step further. And in the second part of my talk, I'd like to somewhat refine these broad categories, because there are varieties of populism and there are varieties of authoritarianism. So we need to unpack this to open these black boxes. Well, there is one variant of populism that is known as national populism. This is, if you want, populism of the right, a kind of populism in which the people the leader claims he represents are not made of everybody, but made of sons of the soil, at the exclusion of migrants, minorities. We've seen this everywhere. Majoritarianism, if you want, is a synonym for national populism. Well, this brand of populism has affinities with a specific brand of authoritarianism that is known as an understatement as ethnic democracy. What is ethnic democracy? Ethnic democracy is a concept that has been introduced by Sami Smoa in Israel to describe a democracy in which you have elections, you have a somewhat independent judiciary, a somewhat free press, but you have citizens who are less equal than others, to paraphrase Orwell. Well, this is authoritarianism. When you do not have equality of citizens, you recognize de facto a reduction of pluralism, and reduction of pluralism is the definition of authoritarianism that Ran Lins gave us decades ago. So there is a specific kind of authoritarianism, ethnic democracy, that derives directly from a specific kind of populism, national populism, or if you want, majoritarianism. But there is one more specificity to highlight. Populism gives birth to electoral authoritarianism. That's another very specific relation. You know, in all the countries I've mentioned, Turkey, Sri Lanka, India, Brazil, people vote. Even Russia, people vote. Because you need the legitimacy coming from the people. Populism means the leader is the people. To be the people, the leader needs electoral mandates. So we have this variety of authoritarianism known as electoral authoritarianism, something that has been theoretically codified by Andreas Schedler, who says certainly there are elections, but you have a distortion of the popular preference, as well as the expression of popular preferences. And that's why it's not electoral democracy, but electoral authoritarianism. You have to have the legitimacy coming from the voters, but you have to win the elections. So the competition is not an even playing field. What are the main distortions? They are very well known, of course. You make sure that the bureaucrats in charge of elections are transferred when they are not pliable enough. Look at the Indian Election Commission. You make sure that you have more resources, more money than the competitors for winning the elections. And you make sure that you have the almost monopolistic domination over the media at the time of the election campaign. And look at the ratio of primetime programs Narendra Modi got in comparison to Rahul Gandhi's. So distortions may appear, may be seen in at least 3 domains: the way elections are organized, the way campaigns are financed, and the way media coverage is guaranteed. Electoral authoritarianism. Well, last but not least, another variant of authoritarianism goes very well with populism. And I will end with this in 2 or 3 minutes because I know that my time is almost up. Well, this variant of authoritarianism is something, again, we owe to Juan Linz, the best theoretician of authoritarianism, to my mind. And he called that sultanism. By the way, sultanism was something Max Weber again had introduced to describe a specific kind of authoritarianism in the 19th and 20th century. What are the 3 criteria for sultanism? Well, arbitrariness, personal rulership. The sultan, the leader, decides, like a Caesar, who will be appointed where, for instance. That's one dimension that is, of course, very much related to the legitimacy that I have mentioned first. When you have this kind of legitimacy, you're unassailable. Second criterion, very interesting, some patrimonial and nepotist dimensions. The state is colonized by not only the Sultan, but also his cronies, businessmen in particular. Now, the rulers demand gift and payoff from business, and in exchange gives his blessing to their own demands. Cronies need licenses, permits, authorizations. So it's a give and take. And the economy is subject to considerable governmental interferences, not for planning, but for extracting resources. And this nepotistic, and if you want, patrimonial dimension of the political economy of authoritarianism is very much in tune with the personal dimension of populist regimes. You can have different kinds of authoritarianism. There are many authoritarian regimes where you do not have this kind of relationship between the ruler and his cronies. In the populist regimes, it's almost systematic. Last but not least, a criterion that I will review briefly is a certain privatization of violence. You need, Ron Linz tells us, a kind of private army, someone who are in a position to intimidate, to fix dissenters, and usually they will be recruited out of the regular forces. Sometimes you can privatize the army itself, but not necessarily. You need them to do the dirty job. And the dirty job is very important, to put the minorities in their place, to put the dissenters in their place. And it's physical intimidation most of the time. It can be other kinds of intimidation, of course. To have a file on everybody is one of the resources you can play with also in these kind of regimes. So my conclusion, to quickly summarize the main points, is that not only populism has affinities with authoritarianism, but special varieties of populism, including national populism, have affinities with special varieties of authoritarianism, including ethnic democracy, electoral authoritarianism, and sultanism. Now, and I'll end this also for the discussion, I'll end on this also for the discussion. The main question for me at that stage is, what about the citizens who have voted for populists who were supposed to restore democracy and who end up with an authoritarian regime? It's not what they were supposed to get. And still, in many cases, they vote again for the same authoritarian ruler. He was a populist, he has become an authoritarian ruler, and still he gets away with it and is re-elected. We may argue that he is re-elected because elections were not free and fair, as I've said, except that when we look at opinion polls, we see that, well, distortions are not necessarily that great. They wanted him. The majority of the voters wanted him. Did they want authoritarian rule? Well, we have reached a point when, in some cases, yes, a strong man, a man who is in a position to, well, protect against some external threat, against some internal threat. So this feeling of vulnerability makes security prevail over liberty. You're prepared to this trade-off. And I have no time to go into details, but look at the CSDS surveys in the case of India, or the Pew surveys, the Pew Center surveys, and you will find astonishing the large percentage of people who are not that interested in defending democracy, in comparison to security. And this is probably the heart of the matter. In the case of India, of course, the way the COVID crisis is mismanaged by the rulers will show that the strong man is not good at policy making. But sadly, we had to wait for a crisis of that magnitude for this realization to be made. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Christophe, for that very lucid, clear insights. You started with the global context. You explained about the decline of democracy in the world due to civilians and not necessarily through military coup. You talked about ethnic democracy, differences between electoral democracy and electoral authoritarianism. You lastly touched upon crony capitalism, privatization of violence, outsourcing of violence, which we call in India fringe groups as well. You talked about that line by Arun Jaitley, tyranny of the unelected. And it reminded me of a recent gem from Niti Aayog CEO Amitabh Kant, who said, in India, we have too much of democracy. So with this line, I invite Sandra to present her talk. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I was asked to talk about populism and foreign policy. And I understood that, well, the focus should be on India and Europe. So I tried to address a few broad themes and areas and mechanisms. Where did this come from? So I've been working together with my former colleague, Johannes Plagemann, on populism and foreign policy for a few years now. And we started from the case of India, which is the one we kind of knew best. And so we did the contrary of what most people do, starting from Europe and then applying their theories to other cases. We started from the case of India for developed very first hypotheses, did a plausibility probe, and we're now about to start with a larger project comparing 5 cases of populism from very different world regions and also with very different thick ideologies. So these are some general thoughts that are not only based on the case of India, but perhaps on broader considerations on populism and foreign policy. So we work with an understanding of populism that considers populism to be a thin-centered ideology. So the definition by Cas Mudde, which is the most common definition nowadays, and it's also compatible, in my view, with many of the other approaches out there, actually. So populism is a thin-centered ideology with 2 core elements: the centrality of the people, so people-centrism, and the opposition of an elite, and the idea that society is divided into these two opposed, homogeneous and antagonistic groups, right? And this, of course, is done as a political project, done as in a discursive manner, right? And the idea, and we heard this already, that populists embody the popular will, the volonté générale, so to speak, right? And so the question is, how does this play out in foreign policy? Does it have implications in foreign policy? And I think Christophe ended on a note, and I think it's a good point to start my presentation here. So why and how get populists re-elected? How do they manage to get re-elected, right? And the literature on populism in this ideational tradition tells us that indeed populists need to keep mobilizing. They need to keep support alive, and they reach a very strange situation once they come to power. They are themselves the elite, right? The elite they opposed before in many cases. They become themselves the establishment, right? So they need to find new ways of mobilizing. And foreign policy, and this relates, of course, to the threat scenario mentioned by Christophe, right? The idea that there are threats to national security, for example. These are very useful tools for mobilization. However, I would say that I will show you some rather counterintuitive findings. So the case of India in many ways is different from the cases of right-wing populism we know from Europe. So the implications of populism at the domestic level are, of course, a very different thing, and there are huge similarities. But when it comes to foreign policy, I believe the context in which India is based really plays a role in leading to these differences. So I would like to focus on two substantive themes, issue areas, which is, on the one hand, contributions to global governance, and on the other hand, participation in multilateral organizations. So how you engage in world politics, basically, as a populist government. And I would like to focus then at the end on two mechanisms, which I believe are important. And we heard about them basically already. So on the one hand, the centralization and personalization of power, which also plays out in foreign policy decision-making. That's the first one. And the other one, the second mechanism, is the mechanism of mobilization and politicization of foreign policy, which also relates to what was said a minute ago by Christophe. So let's start with the first point, the provision of global public goods. So if we think about like President Trump leaving the Paris Climate Agreement, and what we know about other populists in power is that we generally tend to see them as really bad international citizens, right? So they will not contribute to the provision of global public goods, to the solution of global problems, basically because that's the theoretical argument then behind it. They claim to represent the people, but only this very narrowly defined, however it is a defined set of persons. So the people is narrowly defined, and global public goods by definition are, of course, available to everyone, and everyone can benefit, nobody can be excluded, right? So populists in power should be more likely to make, should be less likely to make concessions on global governance issues to contribute to global public goods provision, because they cater only to the people narrowly defined. And this, in many cases, is true. In the case of India, we don't see it, however, so explicitly. So we saw Modi engaging, for example, on climate governance much more explicitly than the previous non-populist government. So why is this the case? How can we explain it, right? And we also didn't see like a big worsening in India's attitude to negotiations on things like trade, etc., where it has always been very intransigent, right? So we believe that here, status seeking, so the idea of wanting to become a great power is really the factor that mitigates the impact of populism in this field. So wanting to be seen as a responsible actor on the international stage is something that really mitigates the worst consequences of populism for the case of India, but not for other populist countries like the US under Trump, which just had the power to do to do anything, and no need for status seeking, of course, and also smaller countries in Europe, for example, for them it just doesn't matter, right? On multilateralism, we have a very similar thing in the end. So from Europe, we know populists tend to be Eurosceptical, right? Both on the left and the right in many cases, or Trump leaving the UN Human Rights Council and all this, right? And there are also theoretical reasons to expect populists to be, well, very skeptical of international institutions and multilateral cooperation. And because on the one hand, since they claim to embody the popular will, they really don't like intermediary institutions. We heard this domestically interfering in this link between them and the people. And the same might apply to international institutions that interfere with this direct link, so to speak. Institutions are also seen as elitist, right? Far away. So in European populists love to blame Brussels for all kinds of evils, right? So this far away, detached elite that doesn't understand the needs of the true people. And also the notion of sovereignty, which is essential to populists, right? So the idea of taking back control in the name of the people, this is something that would also usually, or we would expect populists to be less willing to engage in multilateral cooperation for all these reasons. But here again, we saw Modi, of course, intensifying his engagement, his participation in bilateral summits, so all these hugs with all kinds of heads of state and government. But India has not been less engaged in multilateralism under Modi. So this is also somehow paradoxical, but can again be explained with this need to be seen as a responsible actor in world politics. Right? The last two things I would like to focus on are mechanisms that might play a role in shaping how populism impacts foreign policy, perhaps also in the longer run. And I think this is where we need to look at, and this is also, these are fields that deserve more research. So on the one hand, the first mechanism is the one of centralization and personalization. So we heard already about the phenomenon of sultanism or these tendencies of populist leaders to pursue very personalistic policies. We see this reflected in foreign policy as well, across the board. So India is a case here, but also all populists in Europe tend to do the same and beyond that. So it's really, in theoretical terms, of course, embodying the popular will leads to this personalization, but it's also anti-elitism. So diplomats are elites by excellence in foreign policy, so far detached from what the experiences of the true common hardworking people are, right? So very suspicious to populists. So we really can expect in theoretical terms to see populists having a much more centralized, personalized foreign policy decision-making. And we see this in the case of India, definitely with the centralization at the PMO, marginalization of the Minister of External Affairs under Sushma Swaraj especially, but also to some extent later. And here the question is, the important one is, what are the long-term consequences, right? So what happens if you keep marginalizing experts who perhaps don't share your view, if you don't include more critical voices or perhaps voices from civil society, NGOs, etc., in the decision-making process, or at least in the very first stages, if you don't even talk to them. So that's an important point. And apart from that, it's a point we see also in other policy fields, like in health, in the management of health crises, for example, the centralization, personalization of foreign policy, the marginalization of experts of science in many cases. Okay, and very final point, the mechanism of mobilization and politicization of foreign policy. So we already touched upon this. Foreign policy is an ideal field to generate support domestically once you get elected, or even to get re-elected as a populist in power. And it is so because, well, it's easy to mobilize against external threats and enemies. And politicizing foreign policy means basically bringing foreign policy into the realm of domestic politics, into the debate about about in society, basically making previously unpolitical matters political. And this is something we observe with most populists in power. In the case of India, it's taking place in different ways through different channels, I would argue. So we've seen in many cases rather politicization through this strength of the nation kind of narrative in the case of India. So highlighting the strength of the Indian nation, and not the adoption of this underdog discourse, which we observe in other cases, like in Erdogan's Turkey, where you have all kinds of threats, elites, obscure powers putting Turkey in danger. We don't see so explicitly this kind of politicization in the case of India, but it's more nuanced and it's plays out differently in different communications channels. So I will stop here, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra. That was brilliant. I will just summarize. So you began with the question of how do populists get re-elected? You talked about provision of global public good. You gave an example of Trump retreating from the climate deal. You touched upon multilateralism, the Euroscepticism, foreign interference, and some elites sitting in Brussels. For example, you gave the example of Europe. You then touched upon centralization of power, which helps foreign policy, the long-term consequences of marginalization of experts. Lastly, you talked about mobilization of foreign policy for local benefits by raising external threats. Thank you very much. I would now request Sten to.
Okay, thank you for inviting me to this very interesting meeting. I'm very glad to be here. And I'm gonna speak and I will use this presentation at the same time. So Aliana, can you see this one? Right?
Yes, that works.
Good, I'm glad. Okay, so I'll talk about how India became an electoral autocracy, but I'll also touch upon other parts of the world at the same time, because the comparative perspective is as always very, very important. So I want to first say that about autocratization and populism, I want to add something to what's been said here, and so we can see my perspective on these things. Of course, these things can be driven by elites, but to a large extent also, we should also regard them as symptoms, because they may be the outcome of some prevailing condition here that we should not underestimate. So we sometimes make it too easy to just point out certain leaders and say that these are the ones causing this and that. And there is agency, of course, but we have to take into consideration what is causing also the electorate to turn to certain movements as well. And also one more thing here also, I try to avoid labeling the variations in governance as dysfunctional or as anomalies and things like that if they're not democratic, because and it's not just because I'm trying to be politically correct or anything like that. It has more to do with the fact that if we use too many such terms, we kind of hide that it's very hard to have a democracy. And I don't think there is any natural about democracy either. I think it's very, very difficult to uphold a democracy. Democracy is historically the exception to how people govern themselves and so on. So I try to avoid that, but I probably will fail. So the things that I'll bring up here is, first I'll talk about the long game in India, how India has changed. I will not speak about these things, the steel frame of India and other institutional decline, things like that. There's so much literature on this, and I just assume that you're aware of this. So I try to lift in some other things. And I will speak therefore about, culture and ideology to some extent, and fading memories, which is a world trend phenomena we need to understand as well. And I'll say something about social media and China as well in the end. I want to start here, and this is, I work with the Varieties of Democracy project, and there's a lot of good data available for everyone there to find good indicators of democracy, how it is evolving over time. And here we have picked 4 countries in South Asia then, as you can see, and we get a good overview here on what happened since 1947 and independence. And as you can see here, that it is India and Sri Lanka which are the exceptions. They are performing rapidly very well, and they are staying at a fairly high level of democracy until there is this decline here. And it's a rapid decline. For India, it's a limited time with the emergency, but for Sri Lanka, it's the beginning of a very long downward turn, and things will stay very bad and go for become even worse for a long time. But then you see that India is coming back, and India is the leading star here when it comes to democracy, because it is increasing here in spite of so many challenges, institutional decline, things like that we're discussing. It was still India's democracy survives. It's very resilient. But then there is a decline, and it starts actually a couple of years before the Modi regime. And but then the decline becomes very rapid. And this is something which starts in 2014. And the way things are going now, it is the prospects are now that India will be at the 1977-75 position in just a couple of years if things continue like this. And unfortunately, things have turned for the worse in Sri Lanka as well. So therefore, we turn to the long, I mentioned the long game here. And these are just maps of Lok Sabha elections turnouts. And you can see the Indian National Congress dominating here in the blue color. And things are then starting to change in the late 80s after the BJP changed its strategy and became the BJP, actually. So things are starting to change, and there's a struggle back and forth a little bit in the beginning here, as you can see. But then the BJP just keeps growing, and you have now the situation in the near time here, just a deviation here. But then in 2014, it looks like this. You can see the colors, of course, in orange here for BJP, and then for Shiv Sena in the dark orange, and then also like this. So there's a complete reversal of the map here, as you can see. It is India which has completely changed. And of course, people will say, well, it's the majoritarian system which is doing this, because it creates these big contrasts. But even if you look at the percentage of for each party in the Lok Sabha votes over time since 1984, you can see that in here the BJP starts at around 7%, and then it starts growing. And for a while here, political scientists said that, well, this area was like the new equilibrium for India, that the Congress I and the BJP were going to fight out for this area here, and they would be around 20 to 25% or something like that. But things really start to change here, and the decline just goes on for the Congress I, and the BJP continues upwards like this in an unprecedented way. And how you can analyze this, where there's so many things to say about this. And this is the most simplified presentation you have seen for a long time, but this is how I analyze it. The BJP is a hungry party. It's an angry party. It's highly motivated, and it's very well organized. The Congress I, on the other hand, became complacent. It's like the Social Democrats in Sweden. They are disorganized, and it's based on a dynastic kind of rule structure, which is just hang on to this until they're gone, I suppose. I don't know how to analyze the rationale behind it. But that is the thing. This is how BJP has been winning for a long time. This has been going on for a long. This is not new now. And you know that the history of this movement goes back at least 100 years, right? So what they have done here is that they create a new political culture, new system for how they approach politics. This is they have strategic targets, and that is built on an ideology which is at least partially not democratic. So one may ask here, is this like a civilizational thing going on here, where the BJP is doing the Huntington kind of revolution, where the history is coming up again, and the Congress I just suppressed that? I don't believe that is true, because you can see, if you remember the first graph I showed you, mostly India has been democratic since independence. So we can't just say that this is a civilizational thing coming up, which has been sort of hidden for a long time. That is not how we can understand it. But we should understand, however, though, that there are strategic targets here, and these are not unique for India in any way. The deviant case here is actually Sri Lanka. But if you look at the other countries here, Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, the governments attack the freedom of expression. That is one of the first things that you attack. Also, of course, academics. Academics are a big problem. You have to suppress them because people at the university are horrible because they are educated, they talk to other people in other parts of the world and so on, and then they become politicians and all sorts of things. So you have to control them, you have to suppress academic freedom, because that is like an institution which breeds people like you can see in this panel. So, and then, of course, the civil society organizations, they have to be suffocated in some way. They are targeted deliberately by authoritarians, and that can be part of the ideology and so on. So this is something which you can see. This is the reflection of strategies employed by authoritarian powers here. So that is that with this, but in the context of a larger context, we should remember also, of course, that the world is changing as well. So South Asia and India are a part of a larger trend. This is from the most recent report from the Varieties of Democracy report. Here you can see that the share of the world population living in autocracies, it's gone from 48 to 68% in 10 years. This is a terrible development. And then you have the number of countries threatening freedom of expression has gone up as well. And the share of world population living in autocratizing countries has gone from 6 to 34% in this period of time. This is very illustrative too. This is also from the Varieties of Democracy data. Here you can see in the on the left panel, you can see the autocratizing countries in red here, and how they started to rise here. And here you have the democratizing countries. So this is the number of backsliders you can see here, okay? And this is the declining number of democratizing countries. So, but this is just the number of countries, right? So if you display this way, here you weigh for the population. If you control for the population and weigh in the population numbers, the share of the world's population living in autocratizing countries is going up like this. And the rise here is, it's because of large countries with large populations like Brazil, United States to some extent, but it's very much about India here that we see being reflected here. And here, this situation is Freedom House, their description of how the world looks like today. And in here you have there's no freedom in these blue lilac countries, and here you have the free countries, and these are the in-between countries, you could say. But the share of the world's population today that can get access, according to Freedom House, to free media is today 13%. So the situation for freedom of expression is terrible in the world today. So this is a targeted area, as I said before. I think that the decline we're watching here has something to do with social media to some extent. Christophe mentioned the Pew data available on how people's attitudes towards democracy change. And this is discussed in this book as well by Yasha Munk. You probably know about this one, right? And what comes out of the Pew measurements is that it's the younger population who cares the least for democracy. And if you go to the United States, for example, and you ask people how comfortable would you be doing the following things on campus, you go to the this bar here, expressing an unpopular opinion on social media account tied to your name. Well, not a lot of people are comfortable with this at all. So the mindsets are changing. People are more scared today to express their opinions freely. And it's not only states which are creating this atmosphere, it's about social media and how we interact with many other actors that states and leaders don't have to suppress people's opinions. There are so many other things that are keeping people in check in other ways. We have to appreciate that. And some of the things that comes into this picture is that there are so many things that a lot of older people, including myself, we take for granted. The knowledge about the Second World War, what the whole war was about, partition, the Cold War, the other war in Afghanistan in the 1980s, right? And then this terribly seductive 1990s, which made us all think that we were living in this world where everybody could agree and just not fight and reach international agreements and things like that. If you talk to, when I talk to my students today, they're not aware of these things very much. And in other places, people are saying that, well, the promises they were given were broken. In many parts of the world, the young generation are growing up in a situation which is worse than the one before them. But in Asia, a lot of people have a much more affluent situation than their parents. Still, there is this problem with how we regard democracy. This is to some extent shed light on from the European perspective by Christophe and Holmes. I recommend this very much. But we need an analysis of this for South Asia also. We haven't really understood what's going on there, because South Asia is doing very well economically in many ways. If you look at the human development indicators and such things. So that's something that we need to dig into and understand via our research. And of course, there's a new world order as well. Asia now, the whole production of its economy and so on, it's bigger than the rest of the world. And that means that Asia has taken back the place that it had before. This was the default situation before, and then there was the decline, and now Asia is the dominating force in the world. And this means that we have a situation also where there is an authoritarian, maybe a totalitarian power, which is expanding in many directions, and that affects South Asia to a large extent as well. So I still have hope for a democracy in this region of the world, but we need to refresh our analysis a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Sten. That was a fabulous session, and I wish my classroom sessions when I was younger were as rich with graphics and figures and charts. I really liked when you talked about the BJP and Congress comparison. You know, I have never seen such compact. When you said BJP is hungry, angry, motivated, and well organized, and about Congress, you said it's complacent, disorganized, dynastic. So I think that's a perfect representation for what they stand. I also liked, and I was alarmed to see the share of world's population living in autocratic regimes, which has really increased. I like the fact that you included some beautiful pictures from India and other places. I must tell the audience that Professor Sten is not just a professor, he's a very good photographer. And if you visit his website, you will see a beautiful mural of Benazir Bhutto leading the masses of 1990s, I guess. So please visit his website. Yeah. With this, I hand over to our next speaker, Mukulika. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Anubandh and colleagues. It's a great pleasure to be here. My presentation today, I've called it a story of good citizens. So here goes. There was once a very powerful leader. He was one of the people, but different. He looked like them, but his skin was shinier and his nails cleaner. His clothes looked like theirs, but were of the more expensive variety. The gold chain around his neck glinted discreetly. But he was a man of the people, he insisted, a son of the soil, there to serve his people. He was a man full of arrogance and guile. He was a leader of the people because he controlled everything: what they ate, who they married, where they got jobs, who they were friends with, how they voted. If you didn't fall in line, punishment was inevitable. His preferred form of control was to divide and rule. He provided incentives to some, punishments to others. He divided brothers, bullied women, schemed with allies, but he acted alone. His stamp was on every little issue, every dispute, and he made himself the sole arbiter. Nothing was too small or big for him to seize it to increase his power. Thus, everyone remained in constant awe and anticipation of his next move. People were scared of him, for they did not know what he would do next. But they also admired him for his charisma, for his way with words, his humble origins, his sheer gall. And while everyone did not like what he did, but thought that at least you knew where you stood with one person in charge, it was better than having too many men vying for power. The party he belonged to also admired his efforts. His power over people, his easy use of violence to intimidate challengers, his control over the imaginations of so many were very useful for the party and its ideology. It needed real leaders to take it to the people. It needed people to believe that they could not exist without this ideology, and this leader and this party and his party alone would make them prosperous and aspire for better lives. And so in every election, they voted for him, again and again and again. If anyone so much as expressed a doubt, they were shouted down, reminded of how awful things were in the past, that change was needed, and above all, a strong leadership. And the leader got more powerful and vainer with each election, controlling his followers as if they were puppets, playing with them, using sticks and carrots, harassing women, dividing families. As his clothes got even finer, his nails even more polished, and his house even bigger. No one could imagine any other life, any other existence without their powerful leader. But then people began to see through him and his methods and began to be angry about his hold over them. They realized that the only ones getting richer were the ones closest to him. Their own lives were in fact not much better with rising prices and stagnant wages. But nothing could change, they thought. It was impossible to bring this shameless, dangerous, and arrogant man down. His party was too powerful, the tentacles of its organization too widespread, watching every action. They resigned themselves to living and dying in the thrall of this man. But one day, change began to come. It came because the leader went a step too far. He miscalculated. His hubris took over, and he made a grave mistake. He realized his mismanagement, tried to cover it up using his tried and tested methods, creating distractions. But the more he did this, the more mistakes he made. Soon he was no longer trying to make amends for his original mistake, but simply making sure that he clung to power. And that is what made many people think, enough is enough. There is a limit. We have tolerated this man because we have no other option if we want to live here. But does that mean we allow him to shamelessly violate the sanctity of our laws, the dharma of our society? This time, many felt he had crossed a red line and needed to be taught a lesson. But what could they do? Were they the only ones thinking like this? Did anyone else agree? How would they find out? It was too risky to say something aloud for fear of being reported. So people sat in their homes, watching the next move of their leader, getting angrier and angrier, but unable to do anything about it. As a social anthropologist, I thought I would share the story from my research in India. I don't know if you've guessed who this leader is, and if you have, I'm fairly certain that your guess is wrong. This is the story of the local comrade in the villages that I call Madanpur and Chishti in West Bengal, where I've been doing research since 1998. Every detail of the story is true and happened during my fieldwork. The comrade described above was the local representative of the powerful left-front government that won every election from 1977 to 2011. When I began my research at the turn of the last century, the left front seemed invincible, as was the comrade. People were so terrified of him that they only criticized him in hushed whispers in the dead heat of the afternoon when everyone napped. But gradually, as I won their trust, I began to hear the stories from them and witnessed the change. How did the change happen, though? And the story continues. A young man called Marjee, who had been angry ever since the day the leader had humiliated him in front of his friends for daring to look him in the eye while speaking, decided to try something. He had nothing to lose. He had no job because the leader had ensured he never got one. He lived alone with his mother and they got by on his earnings from private tuitions. He mustered the courage to talk to a neighbor to see how he felt. This was a calculated risk. He knew the neighbor was an old supporter of the Congress and secretly voted for them, but in public he sang praises of the leader. But Marjee's advances gave him an opportunity, and while they did not agree on everything, they decided to focus on what they had in common. The neighbor then spoke to his sharecropper, whose estranged brother was close to the leader. Both the neighbor and his sharecropper spoke to their wives, who spoke to others as they washed clothes at the pukur. Marjee's mother spoke to the parents of the children at the homework club that Marjee ran. And so after a while, many more people were having conversations about the need for change, the need to do something, the need to knock the leader off his pedestal. The conversations continued in hushed whispers as everyone was terrified about being betrayed by someone. But every conversation gave the speaker strength. Every new person who was made part of the conversation added to the growing number, and the awareness of growing numbers gave people courage. In this process, the people of Madanpur and Chishti learned some key lessons. One, you need to find a common purpose to come together, and this took reflection. They needed to identify what exactly they were taking risks for. Were they just opposed to the comrade and wanted to seize power for themselves, or did they want more? Second, you may have a shared history of differences, enmities, and disagreements, but to work together, you needed to suppress these. This meant you had to relate differently to others. Each person had to deal with the personal jealousies and keep their eye on the change they wanted to see. Third, they needed to do things differently to the comrade. They had to treat each other differently, aspire to different things. But how could they adopt these new behaviors when the politics they had witnessed had been full of hatred and violence? They took inspiration from other contexts in which they came together. For instance, they knew as cultivators that during a harvest, each person had a specific job that ultimately created the grain heap. So, one person's job, for instance, was just to cut the string to the right length to tie bundles. But without that someone doing this little job, there would be no bundles of hay. Social divisions were always present, and the hierarchy of caste and age always dominated. How could people forget about those for the sake of this new political work, the new party they were forming? And then the example of Eid prayers, where people of all castes stood shoulder to shoulder, provided the imagination of an egalitarian gathering being possible. And so on, and in this way, they learned to do politics, to do what I call political work, by learning not just from formal political institutions of party and cadre, but from other aspects of their life in the village. And as they began to form their rival political party, Trinamool Congress, the irony was that a lot of their political mobilization was inspired from having observed the comrade himself. The way to describe a member of a left-front party was to say in Bangla, "O party kore," he does politics. And they had seen at close proximity what doing politics required. This political work did not happen just during elections, when turning people out to vote for them was the main goal. That was just the tip of the iceberg. Political work happened in between elections. That is when, tirelessly, the comrade talked to those who might be sympathetic, trying to win them over with answers to their objections, arguing why his party's ideology was the purest, standing by them when they asked for help, how supporting him would make everyone prosperous, and so on. So they tried the same tactics. And in the process, they began to ask questions. How could the local Pradhan afford to whitewash his house every year while they were finding it hard to procure straw to thatch their huts? Why was the comrade the only one with running water in his house? And why were brothers not talking to each other even when they lived in the same village? Why were the women having to live in a permanent state of alertness to the comrade's roving eye, even though he was one man against so many? Why was the comrade the only one who did not use local labor for his fields, even though he talked about the rights of agricultural workers? And so on. It was asking these questions, hearing the answers that others gave, learning to weigh the evidence before making their judgments that gave people greater understanding. And once they realized that many others were asking the same questions, solidarity grew, as did the courage to ask more questions. It is this kind of political work done in between elections that Machiavelli called active citizenship. While it is his text, The Prince, that has become synonymous with political machinations of a leader, we ought to pay greater attention to Machiavelli's ideas in the Discourses, where he outlined what it is to be a good citizen. It is part of a tradition of Republican thought in which collective action, responsible citizenship, and solidarity are key. It is worth recalling that when the credentials of an independent India were being defined in 1950, the words chosen were sovereign, democratic, republic. While democracy indicated the character of the vertical, representative nature of the relationship between citizens and the state, the term republic outlined democracy in social life, the horizontal relationship of fraternity between people. This social democracy in everyday life, alongside political democracy of elections, required the active engagement by citizens and needed constant vigilance and cultivation. Without this, democracy is empty of meaning, and without active citizenship, what Machiavelli called virtue, there can be no democracy. The story I have narrated today provides a glimpse into how such horizontal relationships were forged in one small village in India, but it holds big lessons for us all. In 2013, Trinamool Congress won the Panchayat elections, consolidating their power over their rivals, having won the state assembly elections in West Bengal in 2011. In this month's results, the Left Front won no seats. Trinamool Congress won the largest vote share any party had done in the state, defeating the seemingly invincible BJP and its all-powerful leader. The legacy of doing politics, ideology, and violence continues with valuable lessons for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mukulika, for that beautiful rendition, which was powerful and eloquent. The story of good citizens that you told us, and the tone and essence of it reminded me of George Orwell's Animal Farm, 1984, or even Ravish Kumar recently when NDTV was banned, had this Bago Mein Bahar Hai. Thank you very much for the ground experiences that you shared from Bengal. And it comes from your work, and I also see it comes from the recent results of elections, And but what you importantly did is that you turned our attention from Modi, BJP to other questions, which are equally important and yet related. And lastly, I congratulate you that you kept your promise of catching us off guard. You surprised us. Yeah, thank you. Before I ask some questions to each one of you and to all of you, I just forgot to make a last comment on Sten's talk. I see he has given us a qualitative and quantitative assessment of democracies around the world. And I find it very interesting because if we do agree and can agree on shared parameters of assessing democracies, then the debate becomes more rational and logical. So with these, I now propose that we are good in time. For next few minutes, I will ask one by one my questions. They are addressed to specific panelists, but all other panelists are also welcome if they want to comment. And I am doing it together so that you get a big picture. So I will begin with Christophe. I have some very basic questions, because we do keep hearing about the words populism and nationalism, but we also hear about patriotism, authoritarianism, jingoism, chauvinism, extremism, and a lot more. So how are there any distinctions to be made? Are these distinctions important? Have the meanings and ideas that these words represent, have they gone over any change in the last few years or decades? So that's one thing. I will also now bring some questions or some aspects about France, because I think in India, unfortunately, we don't cover much about other European countries in the mainstream media. And I hope that this session also opens up, as much for other European audience, but especially for India. So I will start with some examples. There is a ban on burqa, le voile intégral, that we say in France in public spaces. There's a proposal of a law to make civil marriages at the municipalities void if the marriage celebrations are cited with flags other than French flags. Some French politicians have been complaining why construction workers are speaking in a language other than French. There is a proposed law to ban virginity certificates to Muslim women by doctors. Then there is this debate of the grand remplacement, which is big replacement, idea coined by Renaud Camus in 2010 and other right-wing proponents. So this is similar to what we see in India, this fear that Muslims will outnumber one day Hindus. Coming back to France, Muslims are less than 10%, so it's mathematically not possible, that apart. And then we also see ideas like the Republican values, the Republican ethos, the Republican principles, the etiquettes, the manners, the dressing sense. For example, recently, the French education minister, Jean-Michel Blanquer, he objected to a girl's dressing sense at school, saying that it doesn't fit to the Republican idea of dressing, So I see that there is this idea that our collective sentiments, values, culture are prone to being hurt, the same syndrome that we see also in India, where we also see banning of books, films, beef, conversion, and all that, So do you think that is the French polity, in a way, because there are elections next year, in a way is pampering to the perceived public perception, whether it's right or wrong. And if there are any corollaries, for example, the Congress, we accuse it of being soft Hindutva to co-opt the BJP. So do you see it in this context? And I would extend this question perhaps also to Sandra and Sten, if they have any similar examples from Germany or Sweden. I would move ahead then, again to Christophe, but also to Sten this time, because a lot of people in India see them only as experts on India. They might not know that both these experts have written extensive books on Pakistan. They have visited and they have studied Pakistan very thoroughly. So I have this question, how do you think it's Pakistan, and when I say Pakistan, the people, the government, the army, is looking at these last 7 years of Modi rule in India? For example, I was listening to a webinar from Pakistan a few days before, and it said that the autocratic president Zia-ul Haq, which ruled from 1978 to 88, if he had access, the way Modi has, to the same media, both electronic and social, the same amount of resources, what havoc he would have caused in Pakistan, So they are in a way happy that it didn't happen to them in these times, I would move next to Sandra. You have very eloquently talked about the foreign policy inconsistencies or consistencies, and relating it to the populist governments. But I would like to ask you, are there any positive or surprising aspects coming from on foreign policy issues coming from these populist leaders? For example, Trump did try to talk to North Korea, and whether he succeeded or not, that's another matter. Nobody else really did it that strongly, and he bombed less countries than Obama or earlier governments, presidents. If I take an example of India, when Vajpayee came to power in 1998, sorry, and he was until 2005, and we had Musharraf on the other side. We also saw peace talks. Whether they had any substantial success or not, that's another matter. But people perceived that it was the best combination because in India we had the extremist party in coalition and also army on the other side in Pakistan. And do you see such examples coming from Bolsonaro and Erdogan and their policies? Yes. So I think we just learned yesterday that European Union suspended its trade relations or trade deals with China owing to human rights question. But we also know that European Union has trade deals with the Mercosur countries, which include Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and the European Union has a free trade deal with them. And it is seen that Amazonia is the region that produces 20% of the oxygen at the global level. And since last 10 years, this region is emitting more carbon than it is absorbing. And yet, European Union is trying to reinforce these deals. So I wanted to also see foreign policy in this context, with China and Mercosur context. I will move now to Mukulika, and this is the last set of questions that I have. A lot of people say that India is a very young democracy, and that's why all these problems, compared to the Europe and to the West in general, How valid do you think this argument is? Because European democracies are 100, 150, 200 years mature, and yet we see challenges in terms of Trump, we saw also in Europe. So India, in a way, also surprised the world on account of the progress it made on democratic criteria. How do you look at it? And also, India's democracy didn't come since 2014. European Union uses this argument to push trade deals with India instead of China, saying that we prefer India because it's democracy. But all these years, the strong trade relations with China and European Union did not show any progress on account of democratic credentials of China. So how do you think the same strategy would work with India, especially in the light of what's happening since 2014? I come now to European Union part, because we know that this is again for the Indian audience who unfortunately do not have enough access to what's happening in Europe. So at the European Union level, there is clearly a democratic deficit. You have the European Parliament, which does not have enough powers. It cannot even propose a new law on its own. You have other bodies like European Council and Commission, which are not democratically elected. They are nominated by member countries. Then you have right-wing parties, which are within the European Union and trying to weaken it. Yes, right. I would move next. I can also cite an example of the referendums that we see happening in European Union. In 2005, for example, France and Holland voted for a no for a pan-European constitution. And 2 years later, the European Union brings the Lisbon Treaty and validates exactly the same set of arguments. So that's a subversion of the public mood that you collected. Again, going back to the referendums, the only referendum that happened in any country for adhesion of other new countries was in France in 1972 for ratifying inclusion of England, Denmark, and Ireland. Since then, 10 new additions were made in 2004. Bulgaria and Romania entered in 2007, and Croatia in 2014. And it was validated only by the national parliaments of the existing member countries. There were no referendums. And there was a proposal by France for a more gradual expansion of EU, allowing the Western European society to digest and accept, which was these changes, these inclusions, and this was rejected by European Union. So there seems some inconsistent approach. And very lastly, we also have examples of Poland and Hungary, and some very serious developments happening in these countries within European Union. So how legitimate is European Union's right to show fingers to India or other autocratic nations when it is clueless how to handle the situation at home? Sorry, this was long, but I think this gives you the perspective and the information I wanted to share. So I open the floor and I would request we go in the same sequence. So Christophe, please go ahead.
Thank you, Anu, for these remarks and questions. I will pick and choose because the list is very long, but very relevant. I will not review all the isms you have listed because we may have to, well, have a special session on this. Only one remark on this. Indeed, words are loaded and change over time. Populism has not always meant the same thing. I will just pick up that one. Populism was something of the left. Do remember the first Russian intellectuals who went to the people in the 19th century, or the American farmers who created the People's Party in the late 19th century, or Perón in Argentina, who was certainly more of the left than on the right. There are definitely a populism of the left and of the right. So it's a style of politics, not an ideology. So populism is saying us this variety. You can say the same with nationalism, between the nationalism of the freedom fighters of India in 1930 and the nationalism of RSS today. There is a gulf. So definitely, that's why I spent always some time looking at concepts. They have to be clarified. They are not meaningful by themselves. They need to be put in perspective. The second point is very important, and in fact, I will connect it with the last one. It's not an Indian problem only, for sure. Nationalism. I mean, the new brand of nationalism that we are seeing today at the expense of multiculturalism. France, indeed, is a very disturbing country these days. In exactly 1 year, there are elections, which may result in, for the first time in the history of this country, the rise to power of an extreme rightist party. That's certainly a risk. The number one party in this country is following this ideology. So this is why we have to join hands. This is why it's not a fight that is limited to X or Y. This is definitely a global battle that has to be fought. And as you say, those who have to be careful in the first place are those who are running after these extremists. Because as we used to say in the 90s, when Congress was doing it, the voters will prefer the original to the copy. And I remember I was telling my Congress friends in 1886, 87, 88, 89, when Rajiv Gandhi inaugurated the Shilanyas, November 1989, preparing the ground for an election that saw the rise of BJP for the first time. I kept telling, do not play in their hands. This is exactly what the French people who are supposed to be Republicans, who are supposed to be moderate, but who are definitely running after the extremists are doing today. So there is no doubt that we are in a very similar situation here. With one caveat when you look at the EU, and it's an important caveat. I would not share your pessimism vis-a-vis the EU institutions. And I would like to emphasize something that has just happened in the parliament last week. when a resolution was passed by the EU Parliament just before the EU-India summit. And I just read 6 lines, but the resolution at large has to be read. The Parliament of the EU decided, I quote, to encourage India as the world's largest democracy to demonstrate its commitment to respecting and protecting the freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association, to end attacks against and to release arbitrarily detained human rights defenders and journalists, including in the Indian administered part of Kashmir, to repeal laws that may be used to silence dissent and to ensure accountability for human rights violations. Well, I can't remember any Indian government having to receive a resolution of that kind since emergency. And we will see what the country members will do. But next year in Germany, there may be a government with Green Party members who are responsible for the overturn of this resolution. And it will probably make some change as well. So just to say that it's not as if nobody would not be doing anything or is not doing anything. I think some point of change maybe in the bill. Last point briefly, because you mentioned Pakistan, and indeed Sten and I, but of course Mukulika, who did a PhD on Pakistan, know about this country very well and have something to say. I will say only one thing. You know, Pakistan is probably a country where a point of no return has been reached with a deep state so strongly entrenched that the facade of democracy has become a kind of theater play. I would say this is what Sangh Parivar is aiming at. You may change the government. You may have Congress government back. That may not change many important parameters, including how minorities are dealt with. I would like this to sink, because there is an illusion about the politics or the political as being the ultimate goal. For RSS, the ultimate goal is not political power. It is how you make a change, a deep change in social attitude, in psychological attitudes. So you may change the government, you may change the, if you want, the governance, you will not change the rule. And that's what has happened in Pakistan. All parties have had to fall in line, whatever their ideology was. PPP, PMLN, PTI, make hardly any difference. That's the goal. That's what they are emulating. Sorry, I've been a bit too long, but you had many questions.
That was great.
Okay, great. Shall I continue?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you. I will also pick just a few points as to also leave a bit of room for the questions that are accumulating in the Q&A here. But I would want to also emphasize the issue of concepts. So of course we need conceptual clarity, and particularly when we talk about populism, this term is really in the media and the public discourse very often used as a kind of catch-all phrase. And I also see some dangers in that. And while I believe that populism, as thin as it is, I think it's an ideology, and here Christophe and I disagree, but it has some kind of impact on its own, but we should really be careful about not, there are many, many different kinds of actors that are described as populists. And sometimes we also run the risk of perhaps well, not acknowledging how bad certain phenomena are by just calling them populists, right? So we throw them all in one big basket, but some of these actors are really hardcore right-wing actors with very extreme positions, right? So of course it's a bit dangerous to put them all in the big populist basket, so to speak. And I follow up on your question on the surprising aspects coming out of populists coming to power. So of course, populists in some cases want to break with the past. So the idea of rupture, of doing things differently from the previous elite is there, I would say, particularly at the beginning. So the big gestures or big turnabouts. So, well, I think in the case of India, at the very beginning, there was this, Modi inviting all heads of state and government to his inauguration. So that was perhaps, well, a gesture. And then the Christmas visit and meeting with Pakistan. So these are points that perhaps, were new. I think an important example going beyond India is Duterte, reversing to some extent the relationship with the United States and China, and ignoring the ruling of the Permanent Court of Arbitration on the South China Sea, which came by surprise. And as far as I read it, the position on China also goes against what the majority of the population in the Philippines actually would prefer. So here you see a case of shifting preferences and doing something unpredictable. At the same time, I don't think populists are entirely unpredictable. They can't be, precisely because of this notion of some degree of accountability that needs to be there, and the thick ideologies they pursue. So if you're a left-wing populist in Latin America, you need to stick to your course. When it comes to the United States, you can't just fully go against your thick ideology, for example. So I would say, yes, they might be more unpredictable than non-populists in power, but not in all cases. Again, here, for example, thick ideology matters in terms of giving continuity. There was a question in the chat that I found interesting. I don't know if I'm supposed to maybe pick it up now or at the
yeah, I think it's the right way. Yeah, please pick it up and go ahead.
Okay, so I'd been asked whether populist foreign policy in the case of India has had an effect on India's status on the world stage. So I would say, well, maybe not the populist elements of foreign policy, but the domestic situation is certainly the factor, and we've heard about this, that might have the most substantial impact in terms of perceptions of India as a rising power, and all that. So all this very optimistic discourse about rising powers and their success stories is crumbling everywhere, right? And I think domestic issues are being taken more seriously than before, at least. So there is some greater awareness. Okay.
Thank you very much. Sten, would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you. A lot of questions there too, so I'm using this very opportunistically as well. I think with regard to Pakistan, I think that they are very happy with, the leadership in charge, and also other members of other parties as well. They're quite happy with where they are, with the fact that China sort of guarding their backs, because there is not much that India can do against Pakistan, so they are insured. And I think also this is a very good proof that we are not dealing with the clash of civilizations, because Pakistan is being backed up by a country which is putting Muslims into concentration camps. And so that is something that you can overlook for completely different reasons, which are guiding politics today. When it comes to EU-India, I think that it was good that Christophe brought up the fact of the resolution there. I think that this is the situation, the relationship that is trying to be, it's obvious that the EU is trying to enter a new type of cooperation with India because it wants to create something else there in relationship to China. It's a response to China, but it's going to make sense to do something with India in relationship to China, there has to be something said about democracy as well, because otherwise it's going to look strange that you're backing up one authoritarian country to sort of create a buffer to another authoritarian country. So this is how it's been sort of packaged, but there is something to it as well. When it comes to the Swedish political leaders, there's nothing much about democracy when you're going to India. Stefan Löfven, our prime minister, was there a month and a half ago, and there was a lot of talk about technological exchange, trade, and all kinds of exchanges. This is what you say when you go and visit other people, other countries, and so on. But the primary objective from Sweden was, of course, the investments and to sell the JAS fighter jets. And in Swedish doing that with the Adani group as the middleman, you know. So I think that Sweden is trying very hard to repeat the Bofors scandal as much as it can right now. So that is something which is troubling, because it is not very conducive for democracy, I think. So it's I'm not. It's very good to hear Christophe's positive note there. So that is good, but there is the trade angle to the whole thing as well. And what is happening with China, you can't understand any of it without taking the China factor into account as well. I think that is good to remember.
Thank you. So there are a lot of questions. If you already have access to questions and you have chosen, we can take those, or I can read them.
Anubandh, did you want me to respond at all or not?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Especially if I have to leave before long. I mean, you asked some great questions, and it'll be unfair to just leave them hanging. But there are just two sets of things I want to say. You know, first, picking up from where Sten left off, this idea that governments in Europe and outside India are going to be the liberal force is an idea very, you know, I envy any of you living in the EU, because, of course, in the UK, this is a government led by a prime minister who self-consciously and rather cynically adopted the Brexit agenda for a political career rather than even a commitment to the idea, just so that, you know, and thereby creating the scenario where Britain needs to, in a post-Brexit scenario, strike these trade deals, of which the relationship with India is foremost, you know, and which is why against, you know, twice the Prime Minister of Britain has had to cancel his trip to India, first on Republic Day, then later. And then finally, you know, the meeting was held yesterday by video link. And the Minister of External Affairs is in London at the moment with a delegation, even though there's such a huge crisis in India at the moment, that this announcement was desperately needed both by India and by Britain. So there's an interdependence of political agendas and trade agendas of governments, which is very different to what is happening in civil society. Almost anyone outside government, even in the British Parliament, for instance, the kind of questions that are being raised, the kind of questions that professional groups, not just academics, but barristers, human rights lawyers are asking of the rule of law and the collapse of the rule of law and press freedom in India are questions that are being asked. But this is not to, I don't think, this comes from a vantage point and can be seen. And I think it's worth saying this, especially for people joining us from India, that there is such a criticism and such a touchiness in the current Indian government to any international criticism. And the Minister for External Affairs in particular has been very stringent in his responses. And I think, you know, as academics working on this, it is worth saying that whether it is the kind of graphs that Sten was showing us, or whether it is critiques and concerns and questions being asked, these kinds of questions don't come from a standpoint of saying the older democracies have better democracy and India has less good democracies. You know, the big hoo-ha about India slipping places on the latest VDEM index. Actually, the US is below India. So, there are questions on certain indicators that, India could have responded with that, but it didn't, saying, well, you guys are no better either. But they didn't. They just don't want any criticism. So I think it's worth looking at what is being criticized from where, but it's not necessary. There is chauvinism. Of course, there is chauvinism and about India being a young democracy. And I want to come to that set of issues next. Now, on that issue, you asked specifically, is India too young a democracy? I think, in certain circles, India will always be an incomplete democracy. It was in 1947 when it chose, and the whole world thought it was a bad idea for an illiterate, poor population to choose universal suffrage and give everybody the vote. Was foolhardy. You needed a certain kind of economic transformation, a certain urbanization before you could have universal suffrage. And I think there is enough academic scholarship on this issue to show that India's democratic trajectory is very different to a lot of others. And indeed, by saying that, one begins to notice that the trajectory of democracy in France is very different to the trajectory of democracy in the UK, to the US, and to Germany, and so on. No two democracies resemble each other. Yes, India is a young democracy, but it is older. Remember, India was independent and a democracy before any of the African nations under colonialism were. And so it is a relative scale. In depending on where you're standing, India is a world leader in democratic credentials and setting the terms for what democratic politics looks like, not just the lip service to democratic indicators. And here, what I said in my story today and my short commentary at the end, I think it is really important to remember this distinction. When the words initially chosen were sovereign independent republic to describe India. And Nehru was quite fine with that. And Ambedkar intervened and said, no, you've got to have sovereign democratic republic. He wanted very self-consciously the words democratic republic, democracy and republic separated. And part of what is happening with our discussions of democracy is we can begin to boil down our discussions of democracy to those indicators, because that is the way to compare and contrast and graphically represent them. But we forget what the commitment to republicanism was in the Indian case, right? And unlike in Europe, where the republic basically connotes that you don't have a monarchy, Ambedkar's insistence on the word republic is coming from a very different philosophical tradition. It's coming from John Dewey in the US, a political philosopher who talked about democratic cultures and how actually the role of the citizen and public spiritedness and participation is what the word republic stood for. And that's why you can have all the formal institutions of democracy, not only elections and political parties, but also an independent judiciary and the media and so on. But this was no guarantee unless you had the qualities of vigilance and cultivation in citizens to protect it. And this brings me to the final point, which is worth making given the absolutely horrific situation in India at the moment, which I think universally is acknowledged to be an enormous dereliction of duty, a crisis of leadership that has caused the current crisis of health and death in India. So it's not just the virus, it is the mismanagement and the lack of planning. And here I just want to end with words of Orhan Pamuk, who the Turkish writer, who Shivam Vij quotes in a piece that he published today on something completely different, on whether Rahul Gandhi can be the prime minister. But he had this passage from Pamuk, which I think reminds us that this enormous crisis that India has at the moment, with mass deaths of people gasping for oxygen and dying as a result, is also a really critical moment to think ahead on what kind of politics comes out of it. And this very short passage, he says, what do we learn about pandemics and political change. And the quote is, "The history and literature of plagues shows us that the intensity of the suffering, of the fear of death, of the metaphysical dread, and of the sense of the uncanny experienced by the stricken populace will also determine the depth of their anger and political discontent."
Thank you very much, Mukulika. And I'm very sorry I forgot you. That was unpardonable. But the replies were wonderful. And there are more questions. I would request Alina to announce and choose which questions are still could be taken. I know that Mukulika and Christophe have to leave. But if Sandra and Sten could continue for a while, we still can have 15 more minutes and take up the questions. Yeah, thank you very much. So Alina, please go ahead.
Absolutely, thank you. So I've tried my best to club together the questions that are in the Q&A box /chat. And one question that kind of looks into the future and requires us to imagine a little is regarding the opportunities that there might be for opposition parties to make a comeback, especially with the Bengal election results that just came in a few days ago. There is some hope that perhaps there is a political transition on the horizon. And this, of course, requires a lot of work to be done to counter the narratives of populist leaders. So in that regard, I think Christophe and Sten would be the most suitable to answer this question of what are the chances for a comeback of opposition parties, and what do they need to do to counter those populist narratives and really put the facts on the table?
I may say a few words, and I'll have to leave you, unfortunately. In fact, I would say that these two questions can be bracketed together, because for me, they are really the same, well, again, two faces of the same coin, because the opposition will be in a position to dislodge the government because of the circumstances opened by the prison crisis. What we see in the last elections is an interesting comeback of, I would say, issue-based politics at the expense of identity-oriented politics. In Kerala, for the first time, a good administrator is voting again to power. In Tamil Nadu, definitely the image of the MK is also based on this good reputation. And you know the story of West Bengal. So the populist being so bad at administering seriously state affairs, public affairs, everywhere in the world, they are dislodged from power, even when the opposition is not terribly strong. But even more when you have good people like at the state level in India. No, Trump might not have lost power if he had handled the COVID crisis in a better manner. Bolsonaro will probably lose for the same reason in the next election. He is losing ground very quickly now, and we'll see. But on the Indian side, for the first time, the graph of popularity of Narendra Modi has registered a steep decline over the last few days. If you go by the last survey that is now circulating on the internet, and it makes sense. There is a limit to incompetence and to suffering. So the opposition will have probably to be there and to regroup for that. But you know, remember 1977, they did not vote for JP or for the Janata Party. They voted against Congress. So to vote against is sometimes sufficient. Of course, you need to regroup, and it's a big if. But if you ask me what they have to do, this is precisely what they have to do, to bring together the main leaders on the same platform and be consistent and be policy oriented, because people need now a state that really delivers. I have never seen a state that is so absent at the moment, and this is precisely what may make BJP so unpopular. I'm sorry I leave you on this, I would say, optimistic note, but we'll meet again and we'll review this in some time from now. Thank you again, and bye-bye.
Wonderful. I suppose if Sten has a short comment on that, we'll take that as the ending note and then wrap up once that is done. Big thank you to everybody who's stayed until now. So Sten, any final words?
Well, well, one should be optimistic, of course, try to be, etc. But I think that political scientists have focused too much on when it comes to India and the decline of democracy since for the last almost a decade. It's good that there is a focus on the Hindu nationalists, but I think that we have not sufficiently studied the lack of opposition and what happened to the opposition parties. And that is a change in itself that has to be understood, because the decline of the opposition parties happened before repressive measures were introduced. So that means that there was something going on there that we need to understand, which the causal order of it. And when it comes to the situation now, then it's very hard to think that just because now people may be tired of Modi and so on, that they will turn to other more democratic alternatives. I can't see that how that would happen, because since the opposition is so weak, where do you go? Where would the people go? And of course, we can see certain trends and signs in Kerala, in Tamil Nadu, and West Bengal. But these are states which have very different politics from other places in India. So who will pick up the voice of the people? Who is well organized to do this, to channelize the voices of the people? So I know that people want to come in on this. So I just stop there. But the final thing to say, decline of democracy in the world is on its 15th consecutive year. So we have to understand that this is a larger challenge on a global perspective.
Thank you. Can I just come in for a minute to just respond to what Sten said? I think you're absolutely right, Sten. That's exactly what people have been saying about the nature of the opposition. And I think people are studying regional parties, but we don't think of our study of regional parties as a study of the opposition, because it's not a national opposition. But you're quite right. I think the Congress needs to be studied more closely, why it has disappeared and the decline of the Congress. But I think, until a month ago, the argument that if people are, even if they're disaffected with Modi, would they vote for anyone else, was a valid question. This is why I'm trying to think collectively altogether whether the pandemic and the current crisis, which is so huge, is going to make a difference. Because it is for the first time I notice on social media, this question of, if not Modi, who? People are saying you, anyone, anyone might have been more caring. It's not even about competence. It's not about ideology. It is about being human, about being worried, about valuing human life. That, so it's no longer about charisma and communication and all the things that we have associated with Prime Minister Modi. But when it literally comes to life and death, would pretty much almost anyone else have delivered at least more care? And this is where I think the regional governments and how they're performing will provide an alternative way in which leaders and leaderships and governments can respond in a crisis. And the story of Maharashtra is an interesting one. Kerala has always been an outlier, but even Maharashtra has shown what it is, what what happens when a government cares and listens to experts. They have people who know about epidemiology advising them. Mamata Banerjee, the day after she won a landslide victory, says, okay, our number one priority is COVID. So at least there is focusing of it. So, I think for the first time, people are saying when literally it's life and death, who would you want, to have your back? And there you might want somebody with a heart.
Yeah, Sandra, do you want to respond as well? Alina, do we have more questions for Sandra, or?
No, I've kind of clubbed them together. I think making closing words in this regard, just mentioning everything that you've been thinking all along and still want to get out there, will probably be the job.
Let's get the closing lines then. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. No, I think I'll just thank you for this fantastic panel. And yeah, from giving me the opportunity to present my work and a few thoughts. And I think we had really useful discussions, and now, well, fingers crossed for the future, so to speak, in many ways, right? No, I'll probably stop it here. Thank you.
Thank you. Mukulika or Sten, closing lines, anyone? I think Mukulika has spoken. Okay, Sten, please.
Mukulika, do you want to say?
I just wanted to say thank you again. I think these kinds of initiatives are really important, and it'll be good to, I think Zoom is such an enabler and democratizer that you can connect people all over the world without ruining the state of the planet's resources. You don't need to fly across the world. You can come together in conversation. We should be doing more of this. That's all. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you also, and it was really interesting to listen to you all here. And we have some things coming out in the fall on autocratization in South Asia as well. So there you will be hearing from some of the voices we discussed here today. More on that later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I will thank you all again. This was literally a treat. We call it a festival of ideas, and I think when we look at this session, it proves why it is so. And this is just a beginning. As we said, we would like to have more such conversations between India and EU, between different countries in EU, between different people. We would like to expand the topics and themes we couldn't cover this time. So all suggestions are welcome. There are still more panels lined up until this Saturday. So please have a look at our website. Please do spread the word. And thank you very much for the audience who was quite numerous and curious with the questions, and also the organizers for having made this possible. So with this, I bid goodbye. Stay safe, stay good, stay curious. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.